All right, we are back with the Fireside PM podcast, and I'm excited to have Chris Berta from Seattle on the show. Chris and I overlapped a lot when I was in Seattle, and I'm still a Hawks fan. But welcome to the show, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, that wasn't a very good showing with the against the 49ers. So I could see where people would lose their allegiance after that game.
The second quarter was pretty awesome.
Fair. Yep.
If it were a two-quarter game, we would have won.
And kept some viewers watching TV.
Yeah, yeah.
The second half,
Apparently, it's a.
I started turning that off and switching to other stuff.
Oh no! Oh no!
I got
Yeah,
pissed off.
yeah. It was. I mean, in some ways, we were lucky to be there in the
Oh,
in
most
the
definitely.
playoffs, right? Yeah,
I felt like we greased our way in, and I mean, from the beginning of the season, no one expected us to be there. So I think we over exceeded the expectations of the team anyway. So I think that's also a good tribute to the coach and just getting people
yeah,
focused. Carroll does a good job of just getting people excited,
yeah.
and so yeah, I now we have all those draft picks from Denver. So who knows? We may end up having something a bit of a run here.
You never know. You never know. I mean, in a way, Carol as a leader shows what you can do even if you don't have like superstar talent across the board. But if you can find a way to pull people together and, you know, gel and come together as a team and have a common mission and get them fired up and help them, improve every game, like you end up in the playoffs when you really shouldn't be.
Could be. Yeah. Well, you see
Yeah.
this all the time with you have all-star teams that can't get out of into the playoffs. They have all-star talent across the board, but they just don't mesh. And there's
Yeah.
personality conflicts and stuff like that. I mean, look at the Nets, in
Yeah.
basketball. So
Yeah.
I just think he does a great job of just getting everybody on the same page, but also just having competition for everything.
Yeah.
And so that's how
Yeah.
so for every spot, everything, he just preaches competition. And with that, the cream will rise to the top. And so you may not have the name associated, your name may
Mm-hmm.
not be a complete star, but you'll rise to the top if you compete well and you demonstrate your capabilities over time.
Totally. Totally. Well, let's get into. We could talk about the Hawks for a
Yeah.
while, but let's talk about. We'll start with your background for folks who don't know you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dig into the craft
Yeah.
that you perform. Yeah.
I've had a kind of an interesting background career. When I first got out of college, I started off in sales with a company called Seattle's Best Coffee, and so that was a coffee company right when the coffee boom was starting, the gourmet
Mm-hmm.
coffee, and so I set up the distribution channels to sell through cruise lines, hotels, restaurants, etc. And then somebody introduced me to something called the internet, and I was like, oh, interesting. That might be something. And so I joined a company called Avenue A in
Oh yeah.
1998. And Avenue A was competing with DoubleClick at the time around ad tracking and online advertising. And then we changed that name to A Quantive while we were there, went public, etc. And then ultimately it got sold to Microsoft. And then I went over to Amazon and was a product manager there for a little over a year. In part, again, with the Associates Group, which was building ad capabilities for their partner websites. And so that people could sell Amazon products more easily. And then went over to Washington Mutual to head up the online marketing there. So following the trends of the internet and how its impact on advertising really through those different years, and then went and started recruiting. A friend of mine had started the Laurel Group, and so he was a former partner at Hydric. And so he said, "Hey, I'm starting the company called the Laurel Group. We're going to be a boutique executive search firm." I really didn't have much exposure to recruiting. I thought they were all used car salesmen and charlatans and stuff. And so I said, no, I pushed them off for probably about 6 months, a year. And then finally, he just said, hey, come on, we need to have you come on board. We want to build this thing out, especially focusing on technology and where technology and marketing intersect. And so that's where I came on board, and that was about 20 years ago. So
Wow.
it's been a crazy run. We've seen the .com implosion, we've seen the financial implosion. Now we're seeing this downturn, and so you see different trends, and these are all cycles, and we're going to see that through this as well. And as I'm looking at this, it's not going to be as impactful to the broader economy like the financial market meltdown happened, because that really had its that was the foundation of so much. Here we're touching, I think I saw a stat that the technology sector touches about 2% of the overall economy. And so, given those numbers, you go, okay, that is understandable. And it's painful. We're feeling the brunt of this as well. So it's painful for those people that are affected. But it's been something that has, I think we overshot or exceeded the growth last year, 2 years ago. We had record-setting years, 21 and 22. And it was just because people were in a hiring frenzy.
Yeah.
And I mean, even, Google, for example, they cut 12,000 yesterday, or in the process, they announced that they're going to make 12,000 cuts. And, that's painful for each person. But they had hired 68,000, from 2019 to the end of 2022. So, there's still going to be an increase of 56,000 employees since 2019. So, I mean, it's painful, and I get that, but it's almost a knee-jerk. I say knee-jerk, but it's a reaction to the over hiring that they did a couple years ago.
Yeah, it might be like if you're driving your car onto the highway, onto the on-ramp, and maybe you over accelerate and you get on the highway like going a little faster than maybe you need to. So it sounds like a lot of tech companies, it seems like they're taking their foot off the gas. They're still moving forward, they're still growing, but they don't need to be on the highway at like 90 miles an hour. Like 75 is probably good enough.
My analogy that I was thinking about is that people were kind of overeating,
Yeah.
and then so now they realize, hey, I need to get back into shape.
Yeah.
And so now they're doing those first couple of runs that are painful, and you're like, oh, this stinks. I don't know if I really like this. And then, by the third, fourth run, you start getting back into shape, and you remember what that felt like. So I think that's, so the acceleration on an on-ramp, the overeating, I think both of those things are what's coming into play. And my feeling is that companies still have to grow, and they are still going to grow. And so you start looking at maybe the second quarter, when things start to settle down, people will find their different homes. And another stat I saw, that 76% of people had found a new job within 3 months. So, I think there's different areas, smaller companies who were really hurting for finding that talent now have opportunities to get the talent that they were searching for. The salaries are not going to be as inflated as they were before. So now the smaller companies who don't have as big a budget can afford those people. I think also companies, we've done work with other companies that are not necessarily in the tech sector, like a Mod Pizza or a grocery chain or others. And we asked them back when we did engagements with them, why they came to us, and they're saying, well, we wanted people who were technology enabled and knew how to leverage technology to engage with customers in this environment. And I think that's what you'll see as well, is people finding roles like in healthcare or in other areas where sectors that need to understand how to leverage technology better. And
Hmm.
now here's a good opportunity for them to bring on some technology talent in those environments.
Absolutely. Yeah. It seems like there's going to be maybe a broader dispersion of great tech talent across the country than, it doesn't have to be concentrated in like 10 different companies or something like that. It can
Exactly.
be, yeah.
Yeah. And those
T-
companies are still going to grow. I mean, you look at Microsoft still has a lot of roles open, right? And they're
mm-hmm.
in one sector they're letting people go, but in other areas they're growing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's going to be happening across the board. They're just making strategic decisions as to what businesses they want to focus on, and those people that are in those areas are going to be fine. It's the other areas that were more of a gamble, and they were, I think people are just becoming a little more realistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that first year when you entered exec search. It sounds like you were a reluctant recruit. What was that
Uh,
transition like?
yeah. So let's see. That was 2004, and my son was so that was the spring of 2004, and my son was born in the summer of 2004. And that was my first one. And so my wife said, "Hey, make sure that you have a parachute or an exit plan pretty quickly." And so, we were going about. I mean, we were scrappy. We were setting up meetings with our networks. And then had some engagements like with Expedia and some of these other companies that kind of, it was touch and go for the beginning part of it because we had to build out our name, build out our reputation,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like not unlike any startup that we're working with. It's just how do you how do you build momentum from scratch? And that's what we did. And it was a lot of meetings. It was a lot of just awareness programs where we were just saying there and saying, okay, yeah, we can do this, we can do that. Luckily Tom and Jeff had come from, like I said, Hydric, so they had a track record already. In addition to that, they had a network that they could tap pretty quickly as well. So
Mm-hmm.
um, we ended up, like I said, having some engagements with Expedia that led to more engagements that ended up being successful. And so I ended up staying for the year. And then I said, okay, well, I'm going to sign up for another year. And then the momentum built. And at that time, we were in the growth phase of internet technology. If you remember 2004, 2005, six, those were growth years. And
Yeah.
in 2008, we were voted the fastest growing company in Puget Sound by Puget Sound Business Journal. Um, so
Wow.
we ended up catching momentum and growing quickly. And then the 2009 hit, and that was not pretty because the whole financial infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
really impacted everything. And so we ended up having to make cuts then. But we knew the recipe and we knew how to do this then, and so we were just buckled down again, and then just grew it again from 2010 upwards.
Yeah, it sounds like Laurel was a startup in and of itself,
Oh yeah.
and you were joining in some ways as a early startup employee. I'm curious about the actual craftsmanship of being a executive uh, search professional. What was it like, doing your first placement or engagement, and what made it challenging, and how did it go?
Well, it was interesting because, like I said, I had thought of recruiters as being used car salespeople,
Mm-hmm.
and so those were the people that I had contacting me, earlier in my career.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tom and Jeff explained, this is how executive search works, and quite frankly, it's just treating people like you would want to be treated. I mean, and this is the basis for I think almost anything in life is
Mm-hmm.
you know how do you engage with a person? Make sure that you set expectations correctly. We were talking about the whole Carroll methodology of leadership, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's a similar situation where you're upfront, you're honest, transparent as much as you can be, and you treat people with how you would want to be treated as well. So, giving responses back, giving them feedback on how to position themselves correctly for this client, what the client is really looking for, guiding the client on what they need to be looking for in candidates at this level. What some of the challenges will be given their brand in the market. It's just being as honest as possible and positioning things correctly so that people can make that best decision. Even if it's a candidate, giving them the pros and cons and telling them, this is something you'll want to drill into and make sure that you're comfortable with. And then here are the reasons why I think this is a good opportunity for you. And then be, again, honest about that. And then also with the client and saying, hey, here are the strengths of this person. Here are some gaps based on what I was able to interview when I was interviewing in person. If those gaps are fine with you and you can work with those, then yeah,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be a good person for you to hire. And it's just being, I think, honest and clear and set expectations correctly from the beginning. And I always go into engagements thinking I'm in a job interview myself. And so I've got to prove that I'm uh, good enough for them to hire again.
Mm-hmm.
And most of our searches are with teams and with companies that we've done previous search with. And so, it's a much easier business to do repeated searches for the same company as opposed to trying to find new search every day.
Well, let's peel back the curtain a little bit from a candidate's perspective. I'm sure there's people that are listening now or watching on replay who are like, oh, yeah, I am curious what the recruiter's perspective is. And maybe we can start from like, how do you discover talent? And then we'll go into like how you evaluate if they're a good fit for a given role or not. And, we'll start there.
Yeah. So at the leadership position, within product, and I think it's fairly straightforward. It's kind of like sales. You know good products that have been launched,
Mm-hmm.
and products that haven't had successful launches. Kind of like a salesperson. They either make their quota or they don't make their quota. So you can
Mm-hmm.
see that, and then there's a story between each of those, right? So if it's a successful launch, what was the story behind that? What was the product? How did you understand the market to figure out that there was a need for that kind of product? How did you work with engineering to get it developed? How did you bring it to market, et cetera, et cetera? So that's, you can talk about it from a successful product, but then you can also look at it from an unsuccessful product. Where did you miss? What did you miss? What did you
Mm-hmm.
not see? What was the challenge that you faced? And was it an internal challenge? Was it that engineering couldn't build the product that you had defined? And then how could you work around that? And we get brought into, when we do different product searches, a lot of the questions are around the internal communication and capabilities of guiding a organization forward. I mean, the ideal scenario is that a product person is the mini CEO for that product.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you may not own engineering, you may not own marketing. These are all uh, done through influence. So how are you in being able to guide those various teams without having direct managerial responsibility for them? And that's a skill set that is difficult to have. I can see that completely, where you have a strong engineering team, strong leader, and you're having to guide them through a challenging time frame or a product that is going to be difficult to build. and how do you negotiate with them to get their buy-in to say, yeah, we can do this in the time frame that you want, because we see the vision that you're painting.
And what's the best way you've seen candidates convey that information to you and to the hiring manager? Is it? I mean, certainly, I would imagine most of it is, well, what have you done? Like, do you have the track record to prove this? I'm curious about for those candidates who have similar track records, who have done it well. Do you see any difference in how well they perform in the recruitment process? Based on how they're telling their story or positioning themselves or engaging in the process.
Most definitely. I mean, there's a lot in how you communicate it, right? So, are you just telling a story that then almost sounds too good to be true?
Mm-hmm.
And so part of my job is to be like a detective and try to figure out where are those, where the handoffs happen, internally in those communication, and was there tension there, and if so, what was the tension? Why was there tension, and then how did that get resolved? So it definitely is probing those areas that start feeling like there's challenges in that process, and where they have run up against some obstacles, and then how they address those. So definitely that's a piece. Um, and I think we're a lot of people that are good product people, they may not, especially in technology, they may not be technologists, but they understand how to talk with engineers.
Mm-hmm.
And engineers are different than marketing. And so, how do you get the trust and the buy in from engineers who are very pragmatic, very, black and white,
Mm-hmm.
and get them to do what you want them to do, and be honest with you about their timeframes and their, what they're going to run up against,
How
and
do
it
you
really
evaluate
that
that? How do
trust.
you how do you know if this candidate's going to be able to work with probably some strong-willed, super smart eng leads? Is it mainly the feedback you get from the engineering leader's interview of the candidate, or are there other data points that you can use?
Well, we had a search where they said, "Hey, here," they painted that same scenario, and they said, "Hey, our engineering team is really kind of the focus of the company,
Mm-hmm.
and so we need to have a product person who can come in and kind of and hold their own in that environment." And so we looked for people who had a depth of technical knowledge that they could then be one of the, and kind of be a brother, a friend of the
Mm-hmm.
engineers.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had them walk through scenarios where they had to convince the engineering team of prioritizing their product over some other initiatives that they may have in their previous career. And so it was more scenarios, situational
Mm-hmm.
examples of where they've had to be that advocate and then convince a skeptical team on how to work on their product more so.
Yeah. I would imagine the candidates that have a lot of experience doing that should be able to navigate that process and describe, specific examples and go through and show some of the scar tissue on
Exactly.
learning that process and then doing it
Yeah.
well. What are some common mistakes you see senior kind of candidates make where you're like, oh, this candidate would have been great, but they kind of shot themselves in the foot, and it's such a shame because they had everything we were looking for, but you know, they kind of dropped the ball a little bit there.
We see. I mean, this happens at really kind of all levels, but it's not putting taking. They take more of a shotgun approach. So especially when there was jobs running around, right? So
Mm.
they, maybe they took it if they're actively looking for a job, they would just take a shotgun approach and then just kind of wing the interviews and not really do the research. I always tell people to take a sniper approach. Look at, do the research for the company, do the research of that industry, of that market, who their competitors are. See who you may know in that company to be another backdoor reference for your candidacy, and then figure out who the hiring manager is, understand what the challenges are for the company, and come in with a perspective, come in with an opinion of,
Mm-hmm.
what, I see this competitor is doing this in the market. I see you're looking to go down this path. That opens up a great kind of conversation, almost a back and forth dialogue with the different interviewers about how they're competing, and then you can have a meaningful conversation about what you've done in that area and how you've addressed similar situations. So it's coming in with a bit more research, a bit more thinking around their opportunity, and then it's the SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. We come in with that, with a perspective like that. The other piece is, how do you describe yourself, your capabilities, your experience? Because I've seen people go down rabbit holes where they've just talked too much, and then the recruiter or the hiring person wasn't able to get to the second or third question that they may have
Mm.
had, and
Mm-hmm.
so they've talked too much. And then in other cases, they just were too brief and just didn't weren't able to go deep enough. So there's a balance that you have to have in an interview of giving enough information so that they can make a good evaluation of your capabilities, but then not go so much that it just becomes um, unimportant at a certain point. And the way that I instruct candidates is to ask questions. Say, do you want more detail? I can go deeper if you'd like. You want me to
Mm-hmm.
explain that further? And just get that response back from the hiring manager to help them guide the conversation more so.
How do you deal with passive candidates? It reminds me, I did a ton of hiring in 21 and early 22. And our team, our internal search team, would find these, some of them were terrific candidates. And I got it that they were not actively looking. Like, we tapped them on the shoulder. And then when we would get on the call, um, some of them would not have done the homework that you're describing, and I always struggle with that because I'm like, well, they're passive. Like, why would I expect them to spend weeks, preparing for this interview, kind of thing. On the other hand, like, the people that we ended up proceeding with generally were a little bit more leaned in,
Mm-hmm.
and I think maybe the misconception, or I'd be curious to get your take, is people think, well, if I'm tap on the shoulder, I'm already blessed, and it's up to the company to convince me that I should take this job. But really, that's just the start of the process,
Yeah.
and you've got to kind of earn it, and you've got to convince people that you're the right person. Just because you got that email on LinkedIn doesn't mean like you're pre-approved.
It's like dating. And so, you need to have, it has to be a mutual interest, and it can't be unequal. At the end of the day, it can't be unequal on either side. It has to be
Mm-hmm.
equal on both sides. And, there's going to be times where it's going to be more on the candidate side, less on the client side, vice versa. So it's going to ebb and flow through that courting process. But I'll say as well, is let it be your decision. Don't let it be the company's decision. Don't let it be the the candidate's decision. Let it be your decision whether or not you move forward or not. So
Mm-hmm.
put your best foot forward. If you're going to spend the time to interview with somebody, make sure that you go in there with your full guns blazing with why, and then at the end of the day, if you don't want to take that job, it's your decision. But
Yeah.
you've
Yeah.
got, don't let it, because what I've also seen is where people say, yeah, I went into the interview, but I didn't really think that it was something I was interested in. But then as I talked to them, it sounded really interesting. Now I'm really interested. And then the client goes, they weren't that interested. So we're going to move on to the next person. You're like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, you shot yourself in the foot. So you had that hour of time put in whatever research time before that, if it doesn't have to be a ton, but it's just, understanding their business situation and who their competitors are, and come in with just like a point of view, and then how your background maps to that.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the initial part of the process. Let's talk further down the line when a search has maybe two or three candidates shortlisted. What do you think candidates can do to best, set themselves up to be the number one choice? And is that any different than the initial? We talked about the preparation and really thinking about the opportunity and the company and the competitors and the SWOT and all that stuff. How does that look as the process unfolds and you get to kind of the playoffs,
Yeah.
or deeper into the process?
I like to, if a candidate knows some people at that company, if they
Mm,
know some people that are connected to that hiring manager, have them put a good word in for him, and not just saying, "Hey, he's a good guy," but just give them specifics as to where he could be of, or she could be of benefit for that hiring manager. Um, Interviews are an hour long at a certain spot, so people can, if you're a good actor, you can
mm-hmm,
put a good face forward. It's those people that have worked with you for 3-4 years, that have been in the trenches with you, that can
mm-hmm,
speak to specific capabilities that you're just not going to be able to get to in an interview. And I value those backdoor references so much, because they see a person over time, and they've seen them in their good, they've seen them in their bad, um, when they're tired, when they're stressed, and how have they performed. And if they're positive on that person and they think they're a really capable skill set, I value that almost more so than my own interview, because
mm-hmm,
I know that I'm not a perfect interviewer. I don't think anybody is a perfect interviewer. And like I said, you can fake things, and say the right things. It's like a
mm-hmm.
politician. you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
So I
You can
like
even
those.
get to Congress.
You might get.
Yeah, yeah. We've
My
seen
gosh,
that.
we go down a whole path on that one. With how does somebody just get to a point where you can lie as much as you have and still get into different seats within committees? Like, yeah,
Crazy. Yeah.
anyway,
Clearly, that's not the same evaluation process as when you're
no.
hiring. Yeah.
So you end up, yeah. So I like those references
References.
that can
Mm-hmm.
give specific. We were doing a search for Splunk, and I remember the hiring manager said, "Hey, do you have references for for these two candidates?" Because it came down to these two candidates, and we had references for them, and so the hiring manager called the references, and wanted to follow up, and he was asking. So we had basic reference information, but then Steve,
Mm-hmm.
he went in and got some deeper information. Um, and he goes, "I'm going to go with candidate A because that person or the people that she has as references are much more accomplished and much more
Mm.
successful than the other person's references." And I thought that was an interesting observation, that he was stuck because he didn't know if he should go with A or B,
Yeah.
but he based his decision on the success of the references, and that's where he put the emphasis.
Yeah. And how do you think candidates should make that trade off? Like if they have a reference who's like incredibly well known and would rate the candidate, call it 7 out of 10, versus a reference who is very accomplished but isn't, maybe is not a household name or whatever, and would rate the candidate 9 out of 10 and maybe be a little bit more enthusiastic. How do you think about that trade off?
That's an interesting question. I think I would go with the one that's going to rate me 9, or
Mm-hmm.
10.
Yeah.
Um, and hopefully that person also knows me maybe better than the branded person and can speak to things that are in more detail than the
Mm-hmm.
other person could. Um, if I feel like I'm a 10 out of 10, um, and I have questions as to how good of a reference that really uh, branded person is, yeah, I would give the person that knows me best, who hopefully will give me the highest rating.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you because I know when I've talked to references in the past for a candidate, the ones that are most compelling, number one, they get back to me right away.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, they are super enthusiastic about the
Yeah,
candidate.
yeah,
And they're like, you would be crazy not to hire
yeah.
this person. They are freaking amazing. I've been trying to hire them myself for the last 3 years. And then I'm like, oh, okay, this is a good sign. Versus the ones where they're like, oh, yeah, so and so's great and terrific, did these things. And you're like, this is not an, unconditional endorsement. Um, what advice would you give candidates in terms of uh, should they prepare their references, or is it like, hey, if you have great references, just give the contact name and let them know that they might hear from Chris or someone else? Or do you think candidates should be more proactive and kind of structured in how they work with references and get them lined up?
Well, hopefully your references are people that you've worked with and have built a really good relationship with already. And so you can have these, conversations like, hey, they were really drilling me on these areas. And
Hmm.
I think I answered the questions right, but they'll probably ask you those kind of questions as well. Um, yeah, how would you answer that? Or what did you think my strengths were in that regard? And so that they're thinking about that already for when that conversation happens. So I think, yeah, definitely having not just, hey, here are the phone numbers and stuff of people who may be calling you, but actually giving them some specifics as to how the interview has gone.
Hmm.
I think that's key. Um, you know, another reference that story is that I was recruiting a person, and she said, hey, my chief product officer, my CMO, who I report to, would be a reference. I'm like, your current one? And she
Hmm.
said, yeah. And I said, well, can I talk to them? So I talked to them, and I was like, I was so impressed by this guy. And he said, yeah, look, she's great. I don't want her to leave, but if she has a better opportunity, I'm not a good manager if I try to hold her
Hmm.
back. And he goes, all I want was transparency for my team. And if they're getting a better opportunity than what I can offer here, then I'm going to be a fan of theirs and advocate for them. And then who knows? They may be a customer, a client of ours down the road. And, hopefully I've built a good team here that has mutual respect, that if there's issues that if they need to come back, they can come back. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is such a refreshing
Hmm.
perspective, because most people are like, I can't let this is confidential. I can't let anybody know I'm having this conversation, blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah. And this guy was the complete opposite and said, yeah, I want to know this so I can, now I can start my succession planning as well for this spot. And so I'm not blindsided either.
How did the client feel about that? Were they also persuaded by that reference? Did they feel like it was a compelling reference? Because I guess the skeptic in me is like, what? Why are you giving up this person? you know?
Yeah. What am I getting in return?
Yeah.
It was a good reference to the
Mm.
client as well. And my client was really surprised by that as well. And I said, hey, I had a really good conversation with him about this candidate, and he was really transparent, and it worked out well. And then she was there for a long time at the client, the person that my client hired her, and then she stayed there for a long time. So there's just different scenarios that come up, and I just think being transparent, again, going back to that transparent and being honest, and nobody's a 100% going to be 100% fit for a role. So you have to be comfortable with what your trade-offs are, and make sure that where that person's gaps may be, or less of strengths, map well to what your environment and what this role has. I mean, I again, going back to the dating thing, you know, I love my wife, but maybe her toes aren't the most sexy. So, it's like, yeah, all right, I can deal with that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That
yeah.
to me is fine. We'll just make sure she wears shoes. Um, but it's that kind of thing where you find those gaps in, you want to find those gaps so that you understand, all right, what do I need to have on my team to complement this person and supplement those different areas? And I mean, that's where we're talking about a sports team. The best team is when you have complementary skill sets across the board, and then everybody works well together because they understand that there's going to be different areas of strengths and weaknesses.
Totally. Yeah, I'm a big fan of candidates who are pretty transparent about where they're strong and where they're, it's not kind of doesn't come second nature to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, okay, I'd rather know what I'm getting, and then I have full information to know if that's going to be a showstopper or not,
Exactly.
versus someone who's trying to convince me that they're great at everything. And I'm like, And if I kind of am able to detect or, you know, determine that actually they're not good in a bunch of things they're saying they're good at, it makes the whole candidacy kind of a little bit suspect.
Most definitely. It's
Yeah.
that self-inspection, and
Hmm.
self-reflection. And I mean, the nice thing is we have reviews, right, that people have gone through. So,
Hmm.
not only is it what you've said, but it's also what people have said around you. And I mean, it should be mapped out pretty well that, hey, you're really good here. And these are areas that are areas for development.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and, I want to hear that. I want to know what your reviews have said, where you think your strengths are, and weaknesses are. And then that way, when I have you in front of a team, maybe it is a product manager and they're really good in that industry. They're really good at interviewing customers. They're really good at building that PRD. But then when
Hmm.
it comes to engaging with the engineering, they need to have somebody on the team that is more, maybe someone that was a technologist that came up through engineering, that now it's on the
Hmm.
PM team that you can work with them in getting that pushed through the development process. And so you need to know what is the strength, what is the weakness, so you can make sure your team is built correctly to have all those complementary skills maximized.
Chris, we're running short on time, but I
Already?
definitely want to get. I know it went by fast, right?
Yeah, this has been
Uh,
fun, Tim.
yeah, yeah. We'll have to have you back on. But we can't end this interview if we don't talk about compensation and negotiations. So let's say the candidate now has been, the top pick, and they get, this is going to be someone the employer wants to make an offer to. Um, what are some, best practices and maybe common mistakes you see candidates make when they're negotiating comp?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is started from the beginning of the process. It's understanding and
Hmm.
setting expectations from the beginning to make sure that you're within the range. Um, I think there's challenges when the candidate thinks that they have a lot of other options
Hmm.
and they start asking for the moon. Um, you know, yes, you may want to. Again, it goes back to how much you want that role. And so some candidates will say, yeah, I'll take that first offer. But I always ask, okay, where can we make some movement on this? Don't just take the first offer, but just ask and do it in a not a hard negotiating tactics. It's more just,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is great. I'm really excited to get started. I want to have an impact, but I'm looking at this long term. What are some of the areas where we can maybe move this? Maybe it's on the equity side. Maybe it's on the, a bonus. Or if you're getting hired in the middle of the year, when is your review cycle? And, can we make sure that I don't have to wait 18 months for my next
Mm-hmm.
promotion? Let's put that into the contract that I'm part of this next review cycle. So there's different things along those lines. And then also understanding the career track, okay, from here, what does this look like? And so, do I have a team now for, this product? Is there other areas of, or a suite of products that I can now ultimately, folk, target that perhaps
Mm-hmm.
I can start taking on and have that part of the conversation. And then make sure that a lot of this is in the contract as much as possible, is that, you have the, especially if you're looking to have the review cycle happen, because your manager may end up moving and you may have an agreement with that manager, but
Mm.
then all of a sudden it wasn't in the contract, so no one else knows. So make sure that gets part of included in there. Mistakes that a candidate had made, I think it's not thinking through all the areas of compensation and kind of taking that manager's or the hiring manager's word, and then that all of a sudden that hiring manager moves into a different group or moves away from the company, and then they are kind of stuck without having anything agreed upon
Mm.
that is written, so that they're kind of left in a lurch. So I would say make sure that what you negotiate is written down, and that you have agreement on that, and that it's not just a handshake.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely heard of that happening to people where they're so excited they join, and then 2 weeks later the manager moves on and all of the history is gone,
Yeah.
and the new manager, you know, isn't aware of any of this, and maybe just assumes, standard operating procedure. Tell me a little bit about your advice on this common question that candidates get, or sometimes they'll get, which is, what compensation are you expecting? What do you recommend candidates say?
I mean, I asked that same question, and the best response is that, I'm looking for a fair compensation that's going to be, and I'm sure the company, if you're looking for this type of skill set, understands what the market rate is, and I'm looking for what the market will bear for my skill set. And so we can talk about that, when push comes to shove. What's the parameter? What's the budget for this? And they kind of push it back to me, and I go, yeah, no, I'll be honest with you. We're
Mm-hmm.
looking at between this and this. Part of the exercise in the interview process will allow you to get to that upper end of that scale when you demonstrate your capabilities and get them to want you as much as you may want them.
Yeah. And are there scenarios where you think the candidate should be more transparent about what their current comp is, or do you think in general they should kind of keep their cards close to their vest and just go with the market rate and have that discussion if and when an offer comes?
I think if they are outside of that spectrum of that budget, then they
Mm-hmm.
should definitely let them know. Say, hey, look, you know what, I like the company, I like the opportunity that you described, but yeah, when you started talking about the parameters, I'm 20% above that. I'm 30% above that.
Mm-hmm.
If they have stretch and they can get to that point, or they can up level the role, then let's continue conversation. But you know, financially, can't take that 20%, 30% hit. So let's stop now, kind of thing. And so I think there's definitely being transparent at a certain point. Yeah, you want to be, you don't want to waste your time or their
Yeah.
time if you're outside of that parameter by a meaningful amount. And especially if comp is a component. I mean, one of my clients is, they know that they're traditionally 30% under the market. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
in my outreach to people, I include that and I say, hey, we're looking for this head of product, but we're 30% under market. This is where their cap is. Um, but they have, then I put the sell part. They have this that makes it
Mm-hmm.
attractive. But they understand that this is a constraint that will take people out of the process. And I just want to make sure I'm upfront about that because we'd love to talk with you. But if that's going to be a deal breaker, completely understand.
Yeah, yeah. No, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we just scratched the surface. There's so much more we could talk about. Maybe
I
I'll just
agree.
wrap. I'll just wrap with this question, Chris. What's some frequent advice you find yourself giving to friends and candidates that you think people watching this live stream or listening to the podcast later will find helpful as they navigate 2020.
Yeah, I would say that just networking. Honestly, if you think about how you've gotten your roles over the years, it's really probably through your network, people that you know. And so, in this environment, you look on LinkedIn and how many people are saying, "Hey, I'm open to having conversations. I'm open to um, answering questions. My network is open to you. Take advantage of that and be, empathetic. Be aware. And when people reach out to you, if you're not actively looking yourself, but if people reach out to you, respond to them and see how you can open doors for them. I mean, this is going to be a challenging time for what are we at 160,000 people in the tech sector that have gotten let go in the last 3 months. I mean, there's a lot of people that are hurting, and so I feel like my job is to really open my network for those people to help them have conversations, help them to position themselves correctly for these other opportunities that they may be exploring. And so it really is expanding your network for those people to talk to and then just make those introductions. And those conversations hopefully will lead to something productive.
I love it, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing this advice, and hopefully, in a couple of years or maybe sooner, you'll be giving advice on how candidates can evaluate 10 different offers.
Well,
But
that's
that's
what we
not
had.
where we are right now.
No, not right now. But 2 years ago, that was kind of,
It was
people were,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know, you had the acceleration of salaries. You had, it was kind of a challenge, but everything's a cycle. And so we will take, like I said, I'm thinking Q2, things will start
Mm-hmm.
normalizing a little bit. And then we'll get back to the cadence that we had 2018, 19, where it was just, it was steady growth, but it was real growth and it was
Mm-hmm.
logical growth.
Yeah.
Um, and companies aren't going to be over their skis. And I think that's where they got.
Well, if anybody's watching this and is looking to hire senior leaders, check out Chris's LinkedIn profile, and the company's Laurel Group. And if you're a candidate and you get a call from them, definitely take it because clearly they're good people and authentic and sincere. So really appreciate you spending time with us, Chris.
Tom, a pleasure always. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on board.
All right. Well, we'll see you again soon, buddy. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye, Tom.
Bye.